There has been a suicide bombing at Kabul airport in Afghanistan, where crowds were gathered in the hope of getting on to one of the last flights to escape Taliban rule. Taliban officials said at least 13 people were killed, and it comes after days of warnings from Western intelligence agencies that an attack at the airport could be imminent. Well, let me bring you right up to date in terms of what we know so far, because the spokesperson for the US Secretary of Defense has called it a complex attack that resulted in a number of American and Afghan casualties. Kabul's emergency hospital says 60 injured people have been taken there so far. The Pentagon has also confirmed at least 2 explosions which happened close to one another outside the perimeter of the airport. One blast happened close to the airport's Abbey Gate and the other close to the nearby Baron Hotel. The hotel had been used by some Western nations as a staging point for evacuations since the airlift began. Well, our Afghan correspondent Secunda Kamani gave us this update in the last hour.
Details still emerging on this, but from what we understand, there was at least one explosion, as you say, close to the Abbey Gate entrance to the airport. Both British and American, as well as other international troops, had been stationed there. Large crowds of desperate Afghans had also been there trying to get inside the airport. Now, also getting reports that there was a second explosion close by, close to the secure compound where those being evacuated by the British embassy were being taken to. All suggestions at the moment that this attack was carried out by the Islamic State group. Western security services had warned all day about the possibility of an attack by IS, saying one was imminent. The group is much less powerful than the Taliban here in Afghanistan, but it has a history of carrying out devastating, horrific attacks, often on very soft targets. And this would have been a pretty soft target because of the chaos around the airport. Taliban forces have been there at times, checking some people's documents, filtering them into different queues. But every time I've been there, I've never seen people being patted down and searched. Even if they were patted down and searched, of course, by the time that a suicide bomber reaches that point, then it's too late, really, to prevent horrific casualties. Some video being shared online showing piles and piles of dead bodies, so expect those casualty figures to rise, unfortunately.
Secunda, as you're speaking, we're seeing some of the still images from the area with casualties being taken away. Obviously, the situation is still very, very fluid with information coming in. But what are you hearing about casualty numbers?
Well, it's difficult at the moment, partly because we're in a state of flux right now. So we still have a serving government health minister from the previous government, but obviously we have a new government, or we don't have a new government, but the Taliban are in charge. So information is not coming out in the way that it previously would have come out. But from what we're understanding from US sources, a number of US soldiers had been injured. Reports of around 3 US soldiers being injured. Local media saying that 13 people were killed in total. I expect the vast majority of those victims to be ordinary Afghans. That's so often the case, been so often the case throughout this horrendous conflict, of course.
And Secunda, I heard you reporting earlier in the day when, of course, those intelligence reports were warning of an imminent attack, and you were making the point that that information, despite it being known, it simply didn't cut through in terms of the numbers of desperate people there at the airport who were still coming, who were still staying.
That's exactly right. I mean, so many people who are there, and we're talking about thousands, are in such a state of confusion, such a state of desperation, that one, they're not going to be hearing this kind of information. They're not going to be receiving that. They're hearing all kinds of other rumours. They're just trying to focus on getting out of the country. The other thing is that they've endured so much already to get to this point. Many have camped out for days in dire conditions. So what may have seemed to them as a vague or possible hypothetical threat earlier in the day would not have been enough to put them off from going to the airport. There would have been large crowds there still. All the reports that I'm getting indicate there was a large crowd at the time of this explosion.
Secunda Kamani in Kabul for us. Let's head to Washington, live to Barbara Plett, Usher. And Barbara, have we had anything from the White House so far?
You know, Matthew, we haven't. The only official communication we've had is from the Pentagon, and that hasn't been devolving very much information. The Pentagon spokesman has said that there are a number of U.S. and civilian casualties, implying that there are U.S. military casualties because he makes that distinction between U.S. and civilian. We have U.S. media reporting that between 3 to 5 military personnel have been injured. And this, of course, would be the scenario that the U.S. was very much wanting to avoid. As Sikander was saying, probably the majority of those dead or wounded are Afghan civilians. But for the administration, they really don't want to have U.S. casualties at the end of this evacuation effort. And so that is the reason they had, we understand, is why President Biden, at least one of them, was reluctant to extend the deadline. And he had begun warning last week publicly about the possibility of an attack by Islamic State group. This is the kind of scenario that intelligence seemed to be suggesting as those warnings got more and more specific. And they do imply that there was very specific intelligence, because the State Department said to Americans yesterday not to go to 3 gates, including this one, Abbey Gate. So that this is something that they seem to have seen coming. In terms of the situation in Washington, Matthew, everything's on hold. We were supposed to have a briefing from the Pentagon an hour and a half ago. That was just a regular briefing. That has been delayed indefinitely. The president was supposed to be meeting the Israeli prime minister, but that has also been postponed. Mr. Biden, is in the Situation Room together with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other people, of course, watching what's happening, getting all the latest information on the situation on the ground and on the latest on casualties.
Really briefly, Barbara, because a number of guests I've talked to in the last hour, very knowledgeable, all making the point they now totally anticipate that the Americans and others won't be able to get their citizens out by the 31st deadline. Are you hearing anything from the Pentagon about whether flights are continuing or have been paused?
We're not hearing anything official at the moment about whether flights are being paused or are continuing. We do know that the flights are taking off or have been taking off, obviously, from a secure place inside the airport, and that the military has always made the point that it was securing that area and the Taliban were securing what was happening outside the airport. So I would say it's not perhaps impossible for those flights to continue, but we have no official indication of that.
All right, Barbara Pletasher there in Washington. Thanks once again. The situation extremely fluid on the ground. More detail coming in all the time.